Hello, my name is Tanner Kempton, and today I'm going to be presenting on big brain evolution. In other words, how did we as humans develop a big brain that we have today? This might remind you vividly of last week. We just talked about a lot about how humans got big brains and what caused that to happen, but no worries. In the class, we focused a lot on the why we developed a big brain. For example, the factors that went in from early Homo species moving from the rainforest to the grasslands. And we also talked about some of the social consequences of getting a big brain and cooking around fires and all of that. But today I'm going to focus a little bit more on the physical mechanisms of the evolution of the big brain. In other words, how we actually physically developed a big brain, not just why we developed one. Some people might think that it's good looks or our big muscles that led humans to be the top of the food chain, but in reality, it really is our big brains that led us to be the top of the food chain and such an advanced species. If a big brain is so advantageous, why doesn't every species develop a larger, more intelligent brain? Why aren't there more super smart species? It seems like it would be very advantageous fitness-wise. Humans in the last who knows how many years have developed much longer lifespans, better standards of living. So it seems kind of a no-brainer, pun intended, to develop a bigger brain. Well, there's several major hurdles towards developing a bigger brain. The biggest hurdle is that brains are energetically expensive. It takes a lot of energy to get a big brain. So that's the first challenge an organism has to overcome in developing a bigger brain. In addition to that, there's some delayed physiological development, which means that the body matures slowly. Childhood takes longer. It takes longer to develop a full, strong adult body. Additionally, there's delayed sexual maturity. This means that reproductive years get pushed back further, and this can be a big negative feedback as far as fitness goes, because if an organism can't reproduce, then they have pretty much zero fitness. So delayed sexual maturity means that an organism has to live a lot longer if they want a chance to have any fitness at all. So these hurdles have to be overcome if an organism is to develop a big brain. Now, there are several major theories on how humans overcame these hurdles. I'll talk about three today. The first involves just an increase in total energy production. The second talks about a redistribution of energy within the body. And the third is called the cognitive buffer theory, which talks about how a big brain could compensate for some of these physiological drawbacks. Three major theories, but which one is right? Which one is the reason that we developed a big brain? Scientists disagree pretty expressively about this, and there are many studies, both for and against, good studies that offer great evidence for each of these theories, and in some cases rebuff some of the theories. So how do we know which one is right? Well, as we walk through some of these major theories, I'll show that each of them plays a major role in developing the big brain, that altogether they put together this puzzle about how humans developed a big brain. First of all, we'll start with the increase in total energy. This is the simplest theory, just get more. It was suggested as early as 1945, and it's the one that we're most familiar with as a class since we talked about it a little bit last week. In class, we discussed about how the development of meat, eating more meat, and cooking over a fire led to greater energy intake for humans, which allowed them to have increased energy to make a bigger brain. So there's been several studies to actually try to measure this energy increase to see how significant it is and if it really could develop a bigger brain. Problem is, it's kind of tricky to count the energy. There's a couple different major ways. First is called basal metabolic rate, or BMR, and the second is total energy expenditure, or TEE. Basal metabolic rate is probably the most accurate measurement of how much energy an organism creates. However, it's a little tricky to measure. The organism has to be at total rest during the measurement, and they have to have fasted in advance. So this makes it an expensive process, especially when using animals. But again, it's a very accurate way to measure it. The other way to measure energy is called total energy expenditure. And that's basically just the calories burned during a normal daily activity or food consumption. This is definitely a lot easier to measure, but it's harder to get standardized results, so there are some limitations. In 2006, a study by Eisler and Van Schaik measured BMR in a bunch of different mammals, and they actually found that there was an increase in BMR among humans compared to other mammals, but it only accounted for about 2.6% of the increase in brain size that we saw, so not nearly enough to account for having such a big brain. However, a little bit later in 2016, Dr. Ponser measured the total energy expenditure of humans versus other primates, and he actually found a significant difference shown in this next chart here. So there are 4 different primates shown here, Homo sapien up at the top in the gray, and then below in the purple is chimpanzees, in the green is gorillas, and in the orange is orangutans. So the way this chart is set up, on the bottom we have this fat-free mass, so the weight of the primate, and on the side here we have the total energy expenditure for that primate. So these lines will show how much energy was expended based on the mass of the primate. So we can see that Homo sapiens are at the top of the pack. By their weight, they consume the most energy and create the most energy every day. In fact, they found that it was even upwards of 50% more than orangutans do for their body size. So this and other studies do offer some evidence that just increased energy could lead to a bigger brain, but they don't offer the full solution. They don't explain the whole picture. There's not enough difference in the energy to justify so much bigger of a brain. In fact, our brain is up to 4.5 times bigger than expected for our body size. So we need something more. This leads us to our second theory, just redistributing energy. This is the second way, a second suggestion for how we could develop a big brain without just creating massive more amounts of energy. This is called the expensive tissue hypothesis. It was first put forth in 1995 by a guy named Aiello. And he suggested that a better diet led to a smaller gut in early humans, which saved a lot of energy by not having to create such an extensive digestive system, and that energy that was saved could be redistributed towards building a bigger brain. So it's just budgeting the energy a little bit better. Using some equations from past studies, he determined the expected size of certain energetically expensive organs in humans, and he found that the observed size of the gut was much smaller than he expected. So right here we have the organ weight in grams, and then it's split into 2 columns, the expected weight of all the different organs in a human, just based on these equations from some previous studies. And here are the actual observed sizes. So as you can see, the gut is quite a bit smaller, which leaves space for a larger brain, for energy to be used for a larger brain. However, there are some criticisms to this study, that the hypothetical equations he used weren't originally meant for humans, so he had to extrapolate a little bit in order to include them in this study. And additionally, the size of an organ doesn't necessarily equal the energy, so it's not perfect. In addition to that, other studies found that there was less sacrifice of gut among primates in specific than we were led to believe by this 1995 study. So that led some people to look for different alternatives to the sacrificing the gut. And in 2011, an article in Nature by Navarrete found that a good alternative to sacrificing gut was actually sacrificing fat storage. So fat isn't really an expensive organ, but by having lower fat stores, there are some added benefits that save energy kind of indirectly. So having less fat storage means it takes less energy to move around. You don't have to carry as much weight around with you. So especially when traveling large distances, this can lead to pretty significant savings as far as energy goes. However, even with this, it's still not quite enough by itself to show how we saved enough energy to get a bigger brain. This leads us to our third theory, the cognitive buffer hypothesis. Now, we've talked a little bit about how it's physically possible to build a bigger brain, but the cognitive buffer hypothesis explains why we could even try to build a bigger brain. So if you remember, we talked about some of the disadvantages of a bigger brain, such as the delayed physical and sexual development. So to overcome these hurdles, we need to live longer so that we can have time to develop. Bigger brains help us to do this in several different ways. It helps us to avoid predators more intelligently, helps us to get food, hard to get food, find clever new ways to get food and cook food. There's social benefits that can help us as we learn to protect each other and stick together in groups. And it also allows us to pass on information as our brains get bigger to future generations so that they can survive even better than we did. So in other words, bigger brains make us more adaptable, and they help us to, and that helps us to live longer and react to different challenges. We talked about this in the class when the environmental changes were going on like crazy about 800,000 years ago. And the adaptability of a large brain really helped some of the early Homo species survive. In 2005, a man named Daniel Sohl actually tested this hypothesis that a bigger brain leads to better adaptability. He measured different populations of birds that had to be relocated. He followed all these different populations as they were relocated and tracked how many of them made a successful relocation, how many of the population survived. And he found a very strong correlation between birds with bigger brains and how well the population survived. So he actually found that a bigger brain, at least in birds, did lead to better adaptability and survival. So in conclusion, all three of these theories, producing more energy, redistributing energy, and using the cognitive buffer theory, work together to explain how humans developed a bigger brain. So as we continue to learn more, we'll be able to realize more of the pieces of this puzzle to understand exactly how we became what we are today.